To imagine if we came to this conference thinking that we had something that we must share because we know, then we didn't come in the right spirit. We actually have to come in a discovery mode. We have to come as learners, we have to come as encouragers to each other. And it's easy to be critical, it's harder to be encouraging. We're very good at the criticism thing. If moral capability, one of the moral capabilities is the capacity to encourage others, to bring happiness and joy to their hearts. And if we're going to change the condition of the world, we must recognize that the reflection, the physical world as it sits, is simply a reflection of the spiritual world. So if we're going to change the profound motivation that needs to take place in order to make this change, we're going to have to change our conception of what it is to be human and what it is to be in this world. Part of that will be to recognize that actually very, very few things, if any, get started by groups of people. Generally, it's individuals that initiate. And they then collect together. Sometimes there's comparable initiatives, but my point is we cannot have a civilization where we wait for somebody else to do the thing. Because there isn't anybody else to do the thing but us. And as we start, it collects this momentum and we attract forces of working together. And then, as we talked about earlier, there will be a collective surge. So we can't underestimate the grassroots movement. I like the elegance of this idea we have to have a multi-level approach because there are different places where we have to make these changes. Every one of us has different capacities. None should be minimized. Some work at the grassroots level, some work at the level of policy, some work internationally, some nationally. All of these things have to take place in order for the changes that we have to see, but we must not be afraid to raise the importance of the spiritual dimension, but we must do it in a way that is inclusive and not exclusive, so that we recognize that the movement has to take place with due regard for the rights of others. And that includes not minimalizing or marginalizing the capacity to talk about the important things in our life. I think we also have to make a distinction between what religions have done and what the religious community is that follows them. Religions and their sacred scriptures are quite different than the communities that follow them. In fact, they can be profoundly different, so don't mix up the two when we're assessing the value of things. I think if we see that, we recognize that there's a sea change being referred to that we were talking about. I was speaking in Constance University with a fellow that spent the last 30 years measuring moral competency. So he measures moral competency throughout the world, and one of the things he said to me was, you know what's interesting is when we started doing this moral dilemma discussion, helping people to just, he thought we were just trying to get people to be able to be in a room and talk about their own ideas without getting hurt and without not being able to respect each other. He said that's what we thought we were doing, teaching these skills, you know, because he said the lowest level of moral development is to seek for opinion agreement. The highest level is to be able to hear diverse opinions, critically think for yourself what makes sense to you, and then accept those things or not. So he's saying this is what we thought we were doing with moral dilemma discussion. He said now what we've realized is that actually the research is showing that fundamentally people have the same value system all over the world. And when placed in moral dilemmas, they basically solve them very similar with the same moral standards. And I thought, well, that's a profound thing to say. You know, I said, well, how do you think that happened? He said, well, I'm a scientist. I'm just saying what the research tells us, not the why. I said, well, never mind, George. Tell me the why. What do you think, you know? He said, I think it's mothers. I said, mothers? He said, mothers. Well, Baha'i writings say mothers are the first educator. So what do you mean by that? He said, well, at 3 years old, my son says that's not fair. How does he know what fair is? Where did he get the idea of fair? He said generally it's through the interaction with the mother, teaching them, no, you can't do that, you can't do this is okay. You know, moving from a self-centered reality to a reality where there's reciprocity and cooperation. So that was kind of an interesting thing. I said, well, do you think religions had anything to do with it? He said, well, I'm sure they do. But he said, what is interesting is now, in the moral dilemma discussions that we're doing, we realize our purpose is not to teach people how to listen to their diverse opinions, because they're seem quite able to advance those, sometimes perhaps more than they should. That was my words, not his. But he said the thing that they're now we're realizing is that we have them there so that they can begin to realize how actually they are very united in their views. and that ultimately we want similar things, and to build trust between people. At the Bogota conference we were invited to, I remember the speaker said, "Put up your hand if you think you could be trusted." Everybody put up their hand and said they could be trusted. Of course, no one wanted to not have their hand up, even if they didn't think they could be. But then he said, "How many people think they could trust the 3 people to your left and the 3 people to your right and the 3 people behind you?" Well, not many hands went up. I thought, well, isn't this interesting? How could we think we're so trustworthy and everybody else isn't? What has led us to this state? So it's kind of interesting to look at these ideas that essentially one of the goals is to stop, I should say in the Baha'i faith we don't have any ministers or clergy, so that isn't part of it. Duncan referred to me preaching about something. I'm not sure what, which I know what he meant, but the fact is it's not a paid job or anything. But in reality we're going to have to change our approach, our whole approach. I think what's alienated people from religion in general is the idea that we know everything, which of course we said earlier we should be in this position of not knowing, and knowing we have to learn from each other. But perhaps the other thing is that religion essentially is that which binds together, so it needs to demonstrate that capacity more of how to bind together in a common purpose. And the religions of the world have this challenge of saying, okay, great, you're all very diverse and you all like your own ideas and I like mine. Now, how is that going to make a difference in the world? And that's where we have to move it into action. And I think this is where moral capabilities have to come in. And perhaps, they did studies that showed that when we teach what it is to be moral, usually children start to just be judgmental with each other. They know who's not moral, and they hope that nobody sees what they're doing. But in fact, the idea of building moral capacity, moral capability, which involves the development of virtues and qualities and attitudes and concepts and skills, that's work. It's going to take work to do that. And this is where I think we can move to be able to begin a dialogue about what moral capacities, what new virtues, what new qualities, what new capabilities are needed in order to advance. And this is what University of Noor did when they looked at how to create a development project in a rural community. They chose teachers to educate, and they chose these moral capabilities. We added, I think, one, which is the 19th one, which you're going to receive. Anyway, they chose these capabilities because they thought these are the skills and capabilities somebody needs to move the population forward. These teachers became so effective in their localities that the politicians actually wanted the program stopped because they were becoming more popular than them. When the government refused to want to stop that, they said, well, then train us. So it was very effective, and then it kept getting expanded more and more because some of the principles involved had to do with, it was very consistent with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was consistent with the development of skills and capacities of people. So it was very engaging for the community and allowed a lot of unity to take place. The activity most intimately linked to the consciousness that distinguishes human nature is the individual's exploration of reality for himself or herself. The freedom to investigate the purpose of existence and to develop the endowments of human nature that make it achievable requires protection. Human beings must be free to know that such freedom is often abused, and such abuse, grossly encouraged by features of contemporary society, does not detract in any degree from the validity of the impulse itself. It is this distinguishing impulse of human consciousness that provides the moral imperative for the enunciation of many of the rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration and related covenants. Universal education, freedom of movement, access to information, and the opportunity to participate in political life are all aspects of its operation that require explicit guarantee by the international community. The same is true of freedom of thought and belief, including religious liberty, along with the right to hold opinions and express these opinions appropriately. Perhaps you could pass out those things to the table. At the school, we wanted to create a moral framework that would integrate, would have this idea of developing capacities, a constellation of virtues, a constellation of concepts and attitudes and skills in order to create the kinds of changes. So that students that were coming to the school, we said we're inspiring academic excellence within a clear moral framework.